Hello.
Good morning.
Woo, morning. Hope everyone's feeling better than I am. Woo. So, my name is Keskora Yaari.
And I'm Eveline Voss.
We're both from Past Party in the Ember Sands Alliance. We're wormholers. And we're here to talk to you today about what wormhole PvP is and how it's different than K-Space. We're not going to tell you how to PvP and how to win, because there's no right or wrong answer to that in a lot of ways. But we want to give an idea of what we actually do in wormholes and how those fights take place, because they might not be as big or as expansive or crazy as some of the null fights you hear about, but they're still some of the most tactically complex and interesting fights that you'll find in this game.
Definitely.
So of course, what is unique to wormhole PvP? Well, of course, there is no local. You don't know who's coming at you. You don't know who is there at any given time. You don't know if there's lots of fleets around, and the only way you can find out is with visual intel, like actually seeing the fleet or having D-scan or being able to actually go and see a fleet on a gate or a wormhole, as opposed to having intel channels that'll tell you way out in front. So because of that, scouting and mapping is incredibly important. We don't know what's going to be next to us at any given time, so we always have to have an idea and build that content and that map ahead of time by using tools, having mapping, having bookmarks, and being able to navigate around to get that content.
And the other most important part about wormhole space is the mass of the wormholes themselves. This is what probably, along with local, is what makes wormholes most functionally different than other parts of the space, because with a gate you can jump back and forth 100 times, but with the wormholes and the mass you have restrictions both in the kinds of ships that you can use because of the mass limits on the jumping, but you also have the limit on how much you can jump through a given wormhole. And so you have to keep that in mind as you work through it. You have to deal with frigate holes that allow frigates or destroyer-sized ships, and you have to treat that hole differently and handle it differently tactically than you do your normal mass wormhole. And you also have to keep those cap-capable wormholes in mind and know that your enemy always has that option. So it changes your tactical battlefield a little bit more. Probably the same way that you think about whether or not you can Sino, you think about what is your wormhole mass, how can you use this to your advantage. And then you also have to be really careful and mindful of how much mass you've put on a given wormhole so that you can either use it offensively or defensively to try and split a fleet by collapsing the wormhole, or to not get yourself rolled out into a hostile fleet where they already have field control and then you just die. So you really have to keep wormhole mass in mind, and it's one of the big differences of the space. The next part is hunting. Hunting is the day-to-day go-to wormhole activity that you do. I mean, it's the basis of everything that you do in wormhole space. And like day tripping, some people come in and day trip. Hunting just means that you scan through wormholes, which is the most important part, because if you don't scan it, you don't know what's there. And so ideally use something cloaky, and you just try to find people. You scan through chains, you try and find enemies, you try and find opportune fights. That could be a gank, or it could just be knowing that another wormhole PvP entity is in the chain and trying to figure out how to get a good fight out of them, whether you're baiting them or you're trying to catch them moving around before they know you're there. So hunting really just boils down to getting out there, getting in your chain, scanning, and looking for people.
And it's a constant thing. You don't just map out a wormhole and be like, okay, I'm done, time to go back, nothing here, woo. You actually have to constantly be hunting, constantly be searching, because new holes could pop up at any time, new fleets could connect into you at any moment. You gotta always search for that content with the hunting.
And amazingly, you'll find a lot just by leaving cloaky eyes in a wormhole that then other people think, maybe there's nothing going on in here, and you catch people doing something silly, moving, hauling, whatever, and you find a lot just by being out in your chain. You can't just scan it once and go back home. The other thing that you can do is called rage rolling. And this is a term that gets thrown around a lot. Maybe people don't know what rage rolling is. All it is you have a static wormhole, in your home or in another wormhole system, and you constantly collapse that wormhole by putting ship mass through it, and then the new static spawns, and then you just keep collapsing that hole over and over. And what you'll do, there's different techniques, but basically you'll get a new hole, you jump in, you've got sabers on standby, you've got tackle on standby, and you jump in the system and you try and see what's there. It has a huge element of surprise because generally that's a new signature into the system, and so people don't know that it's there. And so if they're not being observant and watchful, then you get the jump on them. Some people will scan further down in that chain, depending on if they want to. Other people will just roll just the hole and see what's in that immediate static. So there's some different techniques on it, but the basic gist of it is to constantly collapse your static to find new content.
It's really, in wormhole space, it's all about creating content. That's how wormhole space, that's how corps and alliances survive, is we get activity, we get people excited, we get fights happen. And if you don't find it on a day-to-day basis, sometimes it takes a little bit extra, and you get some sieges. Those also happen. It's a kind of threat in wormhole space that we all understand could happen at any moment. It's just a risk that we take by living in wormhole space. But now with citadels, there's a little bit of a different thing now with the content citadel, where people will just drop an Astor house in someone's home as a way to basically say, hey man, come at me bro, 24 hours right here, or else I have a citadel in your home.
Right, and nobody wants to give an enemy that sort of home advantage, right? That really destroys your ability to maintain security, and so it prompts that fight.
At least it creates the appearance, if nothing else, that you have to commit to this or else it's going to be dangerous consequences. So we've actually had a couple of those happen. We had one dropped in our home. I spent probably about 24 hours just stressing out and freaking out all day about it. But it ended up being an awesome fight. And those kind of fights don't happen on a day-to-day basis, but it takes that little extra nudge to really make it happen. And then, of course, if you do a siege, then that's a whole nother crazy thing right there, actually going through and sieging an enemy out. Citadels, in wormholes, we petitioned really hard to have absolutely no asset safety. So it creates these giant loot pinatas with structures, and that's a big pull. There's been some structures wormholes, they've been there forever. People come and go, loot just gets locked in it, and when you pop it, it's like hundreds of billion of ISK of ships from people who've been AFK or from the home defense fleet that they didn't field. So this all comes down to now, what exactly are some of these mechanics to get these fights to have these big brawls and wormholes? And that comes down to also not just fighting, but setting up the fight, getting an engagement to happen. And that a lot of those considerations you have to take into effect ahead of time are wormhole type. Wormholes have different effects. They can be anything from moving really fast to having overheat bonuses to small weapons to armor to shield, and that will totally change what kind of fleet you'd want to bring. Because if you're fighting in a Wolf Riot where you have small weapon bonuses and it's an armor hole, you're not going to bring a bunch of like shield battleships in there because that's just silly. It also matters what classes of hole you're fighting in. The higher class wormholes have more mast on them, so you could bring a lot more and a lot bigger ships. But going down, if you're fighting in like a C1, you can't bring battleships, and it's a much smaller restriction of how much you can squeeze through those little connections. So it's going to really alter what kind of fight you're going to have. And then of course there's frigate holes, which that's just crazy.
It's a game changer.
Game changer. But on top of that, then not just preparing, it's a matter of when those fights actually happen and where they take place. In wormholes, we don't have a lot of places you can warp besides celestials, the holes themselves that you've scanned down, some structures, and planets and moons and stuff like that. So a lot of fights are going to happen on the hole that you jump into because that's where people are moving from, that's where all the connections are. It's going to be a high traffic area, there's going to be a lot of fights that take place on those holes. And then, of course, that is a whole nother thing because if you jump back and forth, it stresses the mass, people can escape, there's no weapons timer on wormholes.
You also have to worry about polarization.
There's polarization too, that's another thing.
When you jump through a wormhole, the direction that you jump, you generate a timer. And so if you jump through a hole and then you come back, you can't go back in again until that polarization timer's worn off. Now, fortunately, that timer works no matter which side of the hole you're on, but it still has to be taken into consideration, and you can catch people who maybe aren't thinking about their polarization or misjudge the timer, because when you're on the far side, you can't see it. And so you can try and bait people into jumping back, and then you bubble them, tackle them, and because they can't crash that hole again, now you've got them trapped. So that's a big part to keep in mind, and that is all the way down on the small scale gank, all the way up to the big fleet fights, trying to get people to jump onto the wrong side and get polarized.
And because of this too, with the wormholes fights, bubbles are super duper important. Bubbles are everywhere. I don't even use implants anymore. It's not worth it, because I get popped all the time, because I'm also oftentimes flying the saber that goes in and dies immediately after bubbling.
She does. She's good at it.
I like my bubbles. But so that adds a whole other element where you want to make sure that those fights, people commit to them, because people will run away if they're starting to lose, and then that's kills you're not getting. So you got to have bubbles. If the wormhole is fighting, sometimes you got to pull people off of it so they can't get back to it and jump through. And sometimes you got to keep people from warping around or being able to dock back up on their structure. It's all about keeping that field control. And it also, where the fight happens, will determine if you can use bubbles, you can use smart bombs, you have to use interceptors, all that kind of stuff comes into play.
All right, so on that note, talking about tackle, then Hictors and Dictors are one more. Hictors and Dictors are the primary tackle that get used. Of course, your combat ships will have scrams and webs, but the Hictor and Dictor with the bubbles get used all the time because the field control is so important, like Kes was saying. And so,
I like my bubbles.
You have to have the bubbles. And it's just because of trying to deal with the mechanics, trying to catch people, and because wormholes themselves are so small physically in the game, that it means that people don't end up very far, even if they're unlucky, or in some cases lucky and they roll very far out of the hole. You can always cover everything out of a wormhole with one bubble. I know there are some gates that obviously are too big to get with one bubble, but wormholes don't really have that problem. Put a saber, a devote, or whatever right on top of it, and they can't get out. And then in the same token, you use all sorts of catch bubbles and the same sort of tactics you use in nullsec to try and separate a fleet, to get enemies out of position, especially if you're fighting capitals, to try and pull caps out of position to mess up their warpins and stuff.
And capitals and wormholes are very strong.
Capitals are very strong. The capitals are strong, period. But in wormhole space, capitals are especially strong because usually pilot numbers are so small, right? Our normal fights are 15, 20 people. And so being able to replace 3, 4, 5 guardians with like one triage force auxiliary is really powerful in terms of pilots, because of how many other ships you don't have to bring, right? If you don't have to bring a bunch of guardians, then that means more combat pilots. That said, capitals are not very mass efficient, but because the pilot efficiency is so much more important, you're usually willing to make that concession. There are some tricks you can do. You can put combat ships in the SMA and then bring that through because they don't affect the mass, and then spit the ships out and have your guys either reship or they came through in pods. So there are some tricks you can do to kind of mitigate the mass impact. The other thing with capitals is you have to be really careful about how many you bring. The cap-capable holes are not capable of taking that many cap jumps, right? You can typically bring one cap and know that you'll be able to get it home, but bringing a second, usually you don't get to bring both of them home. So sometimes that's worth it. You're willing to commit that asset. You're willing to have faith that you'll win the field and that you'll just roll it out yourself and get it back home later. And other times you don't. So there's a bit of a gamble there and some strategy in trying to force your enemy to overcommit or to roll their own hole by bringing another cap too soon, and then they lose the benefit of additional reinforcements from their other members that log in or anything else. So while capitals are really good, you have to really be careful in how you use them.
And because of that capital strength, a meta has kind of evolved in wormholes to handle capitals, which is heavy brawl, lots of armor, able to sit on field with those capitals. Because
of capitals, you see a preponderance of Balgorns, because Balgorns are the best ship at killing capitals in small numbers. And so because you have Balgorns everywhere, then everyone flies a Balgorn, and now that everyone has a Balgorn, newts are everywhere. And now that the Jamgoo is dead, rip Jamgoo.
Rip.
Now the way that you even break small gang fights is to newt out the Logi, or you can use some other Ewar, but because of armor Ewar not being the most effective in terms of ability to tank or not die, then you see a lot of newt pressure on Guardians. Well, now that there are newts everywhere, it's affected the entire meta in a trickle-down sense, where you see passive armor tank ships with capless weapon systems like projectiles or missiles. And so it's really affected the entire meta. And even when you do see shield, the shield people have to be careful for what fleets they engage. They have to try, typically you'll see shield pulling range. You don't see a lot of like brawling shield outside of a pulsar, just because that cap pressure, you know, if you don't get your invuln turned back on, then you die that much easier. So this meta really has affected all of Wormhole space overall. And so we see how it changes everything. It literally dictates what strategies even work.
And all this comes down to, why do we even fight? Why do we take these fights? Why don't you hear about these fights more? And a lot of that comes down to the Wormhole community is small. We're a smaller section of the game, and we're pretty tight-knit. We've got our own channels that we talk to people. We have our own horrible tweet fleet channel that we all love and hate at the same time. And we sometimes will post this on Reddit, but a lot of times the only people that will then respond to that are other wormholers. We just like to hear about each other's fights. We like to share them with ourselves, and they're not as big and blingy as some of those awesome Titan fights in Nullsec.
Yeah,
but they're still very important to us. Like,
well, because we know everybody, right?
Oh, yeah.
These are the people that we run into every day. There are not that many Wormhole Corps. There are not that many wormholers. And so being one of the smaller groups in space, we know each other. You learn, you make friends with the other groups. You're willing to shoot your friends. I mean, the politics are very dynamic, like anywhere, but you don't really have the blue donut. We don't really have these like long-standing alliance.
Well, and
agreements.
that comes down to that Wormhole politics are pretty much built on PvP. Like, if you fight, you're cool. If you don't fight, if you dock up, then screw you. Like, it's this constant fighting. Because we get constant fights, constant content, and if you don't fight, you're not really contributing to the Wormhole community in a way. If you don't fight, you're not one of us, so to speak, and that gets the ire of a lot of people, and oftentimes that'll be what ends up causing those evictions and sieges. But at the end of the day, these people that we fly with, our corps have been around for almost 4 years, and these are some of the coolest people I've met. And we're so tight, and we go through all this effort to scan, to fight, to find content, because I love flying with these guys. I love shooting my friends too. I've got lots of friends that shoot. And it's just crazy like that. I can go to these events, and I can hang out with some people that I've seen on the field, and we fight, and we meme, and then we come here, and we can hang out and have a drink together, and it's great. And that's what makes this Wormhole space my love, and I'm never going to go anywhere else. And with that note, I want to go ahead and share this screenshot that I found when looking for screenshots here. And if you can quite see, but let's take a look at how far we've come, because we have definitely lost our way to being a PvP entity. And that's okay, too. People don't mind losing. We're wormholers, pick it back up and go. So with this screenshot, we have this fantastic fleet up here in the corner. We've got Dommies and rattlesnakes and caracals. And what else is up there? It's just the most hodgepodge fleet you can imagine. We're sitting on a hull with a bubble because we're wormholers. And of course, it would not be complete without the one guy in Corp chat asking if he should bring a Drake, unironically. And that's how it comes. You bring what you can, you fight, you win, you lose, and it's just all comes down to having a great time, and I love Wormholes for that. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you guys, and hopefully we'll fight you all sometime in the future. If you have any questions, come find us after.
Yep.
And thanks again, guys.
Thank you.